I am very proud of my Native American heritage and have dedicated many of my years to researching as much as I can about my grandparents and their amazing folklore and stories. Tons of incredible legends live and breathe. A lot of it is downright fascinating, but some is absolutely terrifying. Thankfully, I have yet to find anybody who has had real-life experiences with a Wendigo, and to be honest, I hope to hell that I never do. But another creature that has given me many sleepless nights after researching it is something called the pukwudgie. Now, you might be asking, why would a tiny, mythical woodland spirit scare me so much? Well, the reason is that, unlike the Wendigo, I have a first-person encounter story, and the person who saw it was my grandfather. Now, my grandparents grew up on the res back before they moved into the city, where my mom was eventually born. My grandfather recalls spending hours as a kid playing in the beautiful surrounding woodland. It was much simpler times, and without the technology that is just second nature to children these days, they would have to entertain themselves for hours on end with nothing but the woods and sticks, sometimes building forts, sometimes playing hide-and-go-seek, and other times children would be left to explore the great outdoors, as it should be. Most kids, however, found themselves playing hide-and-go-seek. They'd split into teams and run off into the woods. My granddad held the record for being the longest, and he wasn't about to let that slide into somebody else's hands. Running as fast as he could, he managed to cover a surprising amount of ground before he could no longer hear the shouts of 99, 100, coming, ready or not. He'd ended up in a fairly densely covered area, and was happy it would take a while to be discovered. Backing into the undergrowth, he was almost entirely covered in foliage. Boy, was he happy, he tells me. One by one, he could hear the calls and shouts of others being found, and it was hard not to laugh or even call out with glee. He was well on his way to a new record. That was for sure. But that changed when he heard a noise. To start with, he naturally presumed he was about to be discovered by another kid. So, he crouched down even further, hoping they'd walk past him without spotting him. He could still hear the sounds of his buddies running and the occasional "gotcha" from afar, and he began to try and work out which of the voices from the seeking team he couldn't place. Once he heard all three calling to the others, he figured he must have been joined by a nosy rabbit, or something. He wasn't at all scared at this point, just hoped the critter didn't give him away. More snuffling and crunching followed, much to his annoyance. He had the perfect hiding spot, and was about to be outed by a rabbit. He was also doing his damnedest to not sneeze, despite not being able to see a flower anywhere. There was a really strong floral scent, which was making his nose itch like crazy. And that was when he saw him. Now, I need you to bear in mind something. My grandfather was, 1, just a small boy at the time, and 2, crouched on the floor. This him that appeared barely came up to his eye level, but being short was the only unusual thing about him. The small man appeared to be gray in color, and his back and the top of his head were covered in spikes, like a porcupine. He had beady little black eyes, a large bulbous nose, and a sinister grin on his large oversized mouth. And my granddad knew exactly what this ominous little creature was. A pukwudgie. And he was petrified. You see, He had been told that if you ever encountered one of these creatures, you had to be extremely careful. If you made one wrong move and made them angry, they could and will kill you. And you wouldn't even be free after that tragedy. They would keep control of your spirit for an eternity. Needless to say, my granddad did what any terrified kid would do in that situation. He began to break down and cry. He was terrified, and just this mere presence would be enough for the creature to curse him. He burst into tears. He'll never know if that act was enough to appease this creature, that somehow, by displaying that level of fear and submersion, he had awarded the creature some sort of respect. But the little gray man looked at him. That awful grin, still plastered on his face, simply disappeared. Poof into the air, gone. Too frightened to move, my grandfather stayed there for another 10 minutes or so until his buddies found him. At first, they thought he must have been hurt. Discovering your friend, sobbing, with tears and snot all over your face, curled up on the floor was not what they were expecting. Having managed to calm him down enough to ascertain he wasn't physically injured, they took him home. Only in the sanctum of his own four walls did he finally feel brave enough to recount what exactly happened. His friends listened in awe, whilst his parents exchanged knowing and worried looks. Thankfully, nothing more came of the encounter, and he had not been cursed or attracted the creature to continue to play tricks on him. It took a long time for any of the kids to go back into those woods, but they never saw him again. I love listening to your stories, and I will bet you that most others tuning into this will have heard of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, you name it. But I wonder what they might make of my story, or you for that matter. In fact, it was actually around 5 years ago now that I was driving home from a long evening shift. You see, I had my own experience with something that I can't explain, and I think it was something other than a Sasquatch. It's very typical. These stories always seem to happen at night, with no one else around to verify it. But I guess that's why so many of these things exist and haven't been hunted to extinction yet. So, there I am, minding my own business and driving pretty fast, since there is barely any other cars on the road with me. I'm singing along to some rock tune on the radio, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, headlights on full beam, as it's hella dark. I remember having to slow down as it had begun to rain. So, I hit the wipers on. Just because there was nobody else around didn't mean that I wanted to end up in a ditch. I cursed as the rain got heavier and heavier, because it was now making it even harder to see the damn road. To be fair, I'd driven this route so often, I could almost do it by memory. But you can never take the chance that a deer, or something larger, could take out your car and might just choose the exact moment to run out in front of you. And, as if by magic, that was exactly what happened. Only, if this was magic, it would be the black kind, with pentagrams and satanic vigils. I slammed on my brakes quickly, and how I didn't skid into it, I'll never know. Stopping distance in the heavy rain is a lot more than when my foot hit that pedal, that's for sure. The car came to a stop, literally, right in front of this thing. I say thing because there's no other accurate words to really describe this creature. At first, due to its size, I thought it must be a man. But despite this initial presumption, as the wipers cleared the windshield, and with the powerful headlights on full beam, I could clearly see whatever this thing was in no way, shape, or form a human being. Due to the dark and the artificial light from the car, I was unable to determine exactly what color its fur was. Yes, that's right. It was covered in fur, like that of a bear. But this was no bear. I think it was gray, but to be honest, it could have been a bluish hue. It was huge. Whilst I first, as I was careening towards it, it looked man-size, and now it was right in front of me. I could clearly see it was well over 6 feet, more like 7 or 8, if I had to guess, maybe more. Its head and face, well, again, it's hard to describe, as I am pretty sure my mind was desperately trying to rationalize all of it. But it looked like a wolf almost, resplendent with giant wolf-like teeth and bright yellow eyes. So, apart from the fact that there was a giant gray-blue bipedal wolf standing in front of my car, I hear your listeners shouting werewolf or dogman. Well, here's the kicker. Staring right at me, just when I thought I couldn't possibly be any more afraid, it, and I kid you not, this thing had wings. You heard me. This giant blue bipedal wolf-faced creature had wings that resembled that of a gargoyle, like what you'd see in movies. Bat-like, tears and holes in them. Disgusting. It stood its ground, staring at me through the windshield, just gawking, a blank expression. No, I didn't try anything. This thing just seemingly looked aggressive. I was afraid to make any move. So, I did the only thing that I could think of. I didn't try to run it over, but this thing, whatever I was looking at, looked strong enough to pick up the car, and I didn't think for one moment that I could harm it, even if I tried to. Knowing this creature, had I rammed my car into it, I'd probably only destroy the front of my vehicle. So, I rammed my hand down on the horn and blasted it over and over, hoping for the best. When you're in a state of immense fear and panic, well, your brain kind of goes haywire. And you know what? Startling it at the time seemed to do the job, as it gave me one stare, a malevolent look, and took off. I sat there for just a moment, trying to stop my hands from shaking, and then speeding off, burning whatever was left on my tires. At that moment, I didn't care about the wet roads. I just needed to haul out of there. Thankfully, I made it back in one piece, and you bet that I went straight to the fridge and downed a couple of beers. I'll never know exactly what I saw out there, but I can never forget its face. Its image, its entirety is forever burned in my mind. This is just a quick story that I'm sending you, but nevertheless, it is something that I will never forget. So please, hear me out. About 6 months ago, I was lying in bed one night, tossing and turning, and for some reason, unable to drift off to sleep. This wasn't wholly unusual when my husband, who is a cop, is on a late shift. So, I accepted that I was likely going to just lie there until I heard the key in the door. But at least I had one thing to keep me company while I waited: the baby monitor. The fact I could hear super cute gurgling from the baby and contented little snores from the toddler helped soothe me. It comforted me, even if I could not sleep when their daddy wasn't home. At least they could. As I was lying there listening, feeling thankful it was such a still night, as I could clearly hear both of them breathing, there was a sudden bang. Now, the toddler insists on sleeping surrounded by toys, so it isn't exactly unusual for them to start rolling off the bed during the nighttime, and the baby seemed to be used to it. I waited to see if there was a follow-up noise before I padded down to their room and risked disturbing their slumber. Nothing, and all was quiet, except their little cooing noises for a few minutes, and then a bang. This bang, though, was so loud that it caused all the lights on the monitor to shine. Still not concerned at this point, more like hoping to hell the toddler hadn't fallen out of bed, I headed into the room, still being quiet as a mouse. As I peered around the door, I could just make out their sleeping forms by the low beam emitted from their nightlight. Both were in bed, not that the baby could get out of the crib anyway, and both still fast asleep, although the toddler was making those that I am going to wake up mumbling sounds. I couldn't see anything on the floor when I heard the bang again. As I was now in the room, I could ascertain it was coming from the window. At this point, I was feeling a little unnerved, but more still hoping to God whatever it was didn't wake up both of my children. Tiptoeing over to the window, I moved the curtain slightly and peered out. What I saw next, I will never forget. Thank God I had closed the window that night, because the banging was caused by a hand. A large hairy hand, covered in what appeared to be thick, coarse, dark hair. Maybe it was fur. I couldn't exactly tell. And to be honest, I was so startled and frightened, I don't think it really mattered. I couldn't help myself. I screamed, and of course, woke up both the children, who began crying immediately. I grabbed them both and slammed the door, racing into my room and gathering them up close to me. I heard 3 more loud bangs on the window through the baby monitor. Then nothing. After their initial shock, both children soon fell back asleep. The toddler next to me and the baby fast asleep in my arms. That's how my husband found us, just a couple of hours later after he finished his shift. Being a police officer, he grabbed his flashlight and gun and made a very thorough check of the inside and outside of the property. Coming back inside, he made sure everything was locked up and suggested that I try and get some good earned rest. I am not entirely sure that he believed that I had seen a hairy clawed hand scratching at the window, trying to get in. He is far more used to dealing with human monsters. Oh, and there's one more thing. We live in an apartment building on the 8th floor, and there's nothing outside the window except air. So what the hell did we see exactly? I'll never know. I guess this story begins when I was out for my morning run. I came across a flyer stapled to one of the telephone poles that actually looked recent. Nobody really put things up on these old splintered posts, at least around here. It was the work of distraught parents that weren't content to let law enforcement handle things on their own. It was a notice of a missing little girl from our area, written very strangely. I saw the official missing poster at the post office. The writing, much more tame. I felt for the people involved. I honestly did. The distress they were in was palpable, even to me, and I had never even met the family. The child was something out of a storybook. Blonde hair and blue eyes, pictured in a set of pink overalls with a white heart in the center. Soon enough, though, I couldn't take 3 steps without seeing or hearing something related to the supposed kidnapping. I tried not to think about it while I was out for my morning jog. I don't mean to be cold. I just have to have a span of time where the world's poison isn't on my mind. So, when I came home later, I found something on my front doorstep. A large teddy bear. The kind that would never fit in a household washer. I looked it over, and there was no sign of who it came from or where it came from. I just wondered if it had been delivered by mistake. I noticed that it was hardly new. It was old and didn't smell pleasant. I couldn't think of who hated me enough to cart a heavy, musty, plush teddy bear onto my front step. But a new thought chilled me. Did they know my morning routine and thus know when to drop the bear off when I wasn't around? Then, I speculated that I was being watched. It was a horrible feeling, and I brushed it off. So, I dragged the smelly thing out by the trash bin for the next morning pickup. 1 minute, the garbage truck was there. The next, it was gone. And so was the darn bear. I had uneasy dreams that night. Something dark had burrowed into my sleeping mind. I was dreaming about crying coming from somewhere inside the house, and I couldn't find it, no matter how I searched, and it was getting louder, and I was afraid that I would get the attention of the neighbors, leading them to suspect that I was guilty of something. I awoke in a cold sweat to find that the crying was indeed no dream. It was soft, but real, and very much so present. I couldn't find where it was coming from, and I fought back a tide of panic, telling myself that there had to have been some rational explanation. So, I walked into my bedroom for the 5th time and froze when I finally noticed the window. There was the bear before me, staring in. I lost myself for a moment, the terror finally overriding all my senses. I thought to call the police, but what would I tell them? There was a bear in my window? The crying was coming from the bear. I steeled myself, thinking that this was one of those toys that recorded sounds and plays them back. Surely, this was just a trick. When I stepped outside with the bear, the crying had ceased completely. I was shaking, and it wasn't from the rain. I gave the bear a good frisking, and it did seem to have some weight inside of it that wasn't meant to be there. Maybe the make of the recording device that would tell me more. The bear was already cut open, the folds seamlessly pressing together. Something that smelled awful welled up into my face as I reached inside. The source was the decomposing body of a little girl who went missing, wearing the exact same pink overalls that I'd seen in the poster. Hi, I may not even be submitting this story to the right podcast. You seem to deal with all things monsters. I dealt with a real monster a few years back when I was only 8 years old. I'm 14 now. My mother loves thrift and resale shops. Whenever she goes, she has to take me along, for some reason. I get it, that cheap stuff is cool, but how much stuff does anybody really need? Just because it's cheap doesn't mean you have to buy it. But anyway, she gave me the usual line of it. If I go with her this time, she'll get me anything I wanted. I was 8. It wasn't like I could refuse and stay home by myself, which, in hindsight, would have been nice. So, I'm dragged to yet another resale shop. They more or less knew my mom by name there. She went straight for the clothes, while I found my way over to the toys. Something caught my eye. It was a magic 8-ball in the hands of a plush old-fashioned clown. To my delight, The clown was attached to an 8-ball by magnets. I had always wanted a magic 8-ball, and here I would get a cool clown doll along with it. For once, I was happy to be along for one of my mom's thrift binges. I played with the 8-ball often and put it back in the hands of the clown when I was done. In fact, I named him Herman. One night, I was having fun with the 8-ball rather late, asking it questions and shaking it under the covers by the light of my useless track phone. I froze in place when I heard some sort of shuffling in my room. It didn't sound like a full-grown person was around, but it didn't sound like an animal either. I couldn't place it, so I stayed under the covers and waited. I tried to lighten things up a bit, and I silently asked the 8-ball if the noise was Herman. It showed up as yes, definitely. I fought off a shiver and forced a smile. I again asked if it was Herman, and he was looking for me in particular. It repeated its previous answer. I asked if Herman knew where I was, and it said, very doubtful. Then, I asked what Herman wanted, since I knew it could only answer yes or no, or so I thought. It said, better not tell you now. And if you don't believe me, Google it. It's an actual answer on some makes of 8-balls. I began trembling, and I had to fight it off. I asked the 8-ball if Herman was going to hurt me, and it said, it is certain. No, this was getting far too strange. Surely it wouldn't answer the same question twice. I asked it, has Herman found me yet? And it answered, it is decidedly so. I threw off my covers so that I could turn on my bedroom light. When I did, I totally lost it, since Herman was sitting on the foot of my bed, but facing me where I was at the light switch. My parents came to my rescue. They naturally wrote the whole thing off as a bad dream, and I promptly threw away Herman and the 8-ball, and I never bothered to replace either one of them. Well, the story gets even more interesting as time had gone on. See, I kind of forgot about the whole Herman thing, until a few years later, I guess I found out that there was a rather large group of gypsies who had been donating many of the items and toys to that same thrift store that my mother went to. If you know anything about gypsies and their culture, they are heavily involved in, maybe not necessarily witchcraft, like black masses and killing children, but they do practice voodoo and magic to an extent. So, I almost wonder if maybe somehow, being around that culture, there was a demon that had found its way inside that Herman doll in traditional horror movie fashion. I don't know. That was real enough for me. What I dealt with inside that doll was a real living entity. What exactly was its purpose? I'm not sure, but it seemed intent on wanting to hurt me. Please excuse my lack of knowledge, which is why I'm coming to you with questions. Which I should ask you, if there is such a thing as a shadow cryptid. I call it that because I don't know what else to refer to it as. I had a very recent experience with one of these shadow cryptids, and it's just crazy enough to be worth sharing. So I checked into a cheap, single-story hotel during a business trip I was on. I was dog-tired, and staying on the road just wasn't an option if I wanted to survive. I was in bed, lights out, when I heard movement somewhere. It seemed to be where I had hung up my hat and coat next to the door. I thought that maybe a rat or something had gotten in my room and was going to chew holes in my good coat. Moonlight was now streaming in and throwing a huge white square on the just spot I suspected the sounds to be coming from. And I didn't see any rodents. But I did see movement. I shouted on instinct, "Hey!" A slithering shape withdrew and rose up to briefly take the shape of a person before melting into something like a pool of ink, and then finally snaking out of my room through the crack underneath the door. I pinched myself to make sure that I wasn't asleep and dreaming. I got up, and against my better judgment, to check out what I had just seen. Opening the hotel room door, I stepped into the hallway and looked around. I saw it, slithering there on the floor. It stretched out like a sheet of dried black rubber into the shape of a person, yet again. A single red eye blinked at me a few times. Once again, it collapsed into a puddle and began racing away very quickly. I couldn't tell you for all the money in the world why I decided to chase after it. I was more interested than terrified. It was just too crazy. And I probably sound crazy for not ducking back into my room and staying there. I chased it, but it had no trouble of staying ahead of me. Soon, I became winded, developed a side stitch, but I wasn't catching up. I also started to realize that the hallway seemed awfully long for a place that small. In the moonlight, I could easily read the numbers on the doors. They were repeating. By virtue of some nightmare law come true, I was running through the same repeating segment of hallway, over and over again. It was when I realized this that I think I heard some laughter from the shadow up ahead, except it sounded very deep in pitch and distorted, kind of like somebody playing a recording of a laughter, pitch shifted, and played through a loudspeaker. I gave up the chase before I fell over unconscious. The simple act of turning the opposite direction brought me right back to my room. I overslept, waking up way too late to depart on time properly. I don't know if this was a fever dream or what. I tried to dig up some information on beings called shadow people, but here, the resemblance is very marginal. I get sick when I come near small, single-story hotels that look like they could have a history. So, I'm sending this to you, in hopes you can maybe debunk what exactly I had an encounter with. Because I know, for sure, this wasn't a dream. I did come in contact with something evil. Hi. Me and my twin sister have a story for you about a living shadow that used to give us trouble. We're identical twins. She looks like me, and I look just like her. We were staying with my grandmother for an extended period due to fire damage to our house. My grandmother took care of us, while my mother and father saw to getting our home back and up and running as soon as possible, however long that would take. I don't even remember what woke me up at night, but I had come to just in time to see my sister floating through the air. I thought that surely grandmother was carrying her, and I just couldn't see her for some reason. When my sleeping sister floated across the open window, I could see that she was being held by some kind of being of shadow. I didn't think. I automatically yelled out at the thing to put my sister down and leave her alone. This thing, whatever it was, jumped as if it had honestly been startled. My sister landed on the foot of my bed and didn't awake from her sleep. I was worried that she was hurt, but she wasn't. She actually slept through the entire thing. I thought that was the end of that. Well, it wasn't. I dreamt the very next night about being a small infant and being in the arms of some adult that I could not see the face of. I felt warm and safe, and even drowsy, at least until I woke up. I wasn't in my bed. I was floating through the air, feeling a cold grasp around my body. I struggled and fought. I tried to scream but couldn't. Something chilly and strong covered my mouth. At last, I fell to the floor with a hard thud. Even though my heart was pounding, I could not think of anything else to do but find my way back to bed. This repeated every single night. I would wake up as I was being carried out of my bed by the shadow that tried to carry off my sister. I woke up a little later each time, and after about a week, I could tell that it was carrying me towards the cellar staircase at the far end of the house. I tried telling my grandmother about it, but she didn't seem to comprehend what I even spoke to her. I didn't know what to do. By stopping it from carrying off my sister, I must have angered it, since it only bothered with me from then on out. The night before our parents came to get us back for good, I had woken up just outside the cellar door at the bottom of the staircase. Mother and father weren't a minute too soon. I was okay, and I wasn't. I was fine, and I was traumatized. Thinking about the whole thing was like reflecting on a dream, and yet no dream ever made me shiver that much. I'm fairly certain this was some sort of poltergeist. Last winter, I did a coffee roast in class. It seemed like such a great idea at the time. Meeting new people, learning something new, getting to try my very own coffee. The course was held in London, near Ealing, in a kitchen at the top of a block of flats. It wasn't a bad location, but it was a pretty rundown building. I was attending with one of my girlfriends, and we were both very excited. It's been months since the class, but I still can't quite comprehend what happened. There are some days it doesn't feel real, like I'm living in somebody else's body. At times, it feels like someone has taken over my mind. Every day, things for me have become dark and tormenting. I can't look at children's play parks like I used to, for my innocence no longer exists. Life has become dark, wretched, scary, and even lonely. My arms are filled with icy fear coursing down my veins, and I'm constantly bumping into things and dropping things. I feel like a ticking time bomb, a myriad of stress that is heading at a rapid pace into what clearly feels like a brick wall. I used to be easygoing and airy, but lately, things have gotten worse. Ever since I saw what I saw at that class, the instructor, a Brazilian man who was very flirty with all the women, and even a bit inappropriate at times. What happened was he whispered into my ear that he needed a special favor. My stomach nodded, as I don't know what he was going to come out with. He then told me he needed me to go into the freezer and get some ice. I laughed, and he pointed me in the direction of the freezer, which was just down a corridor and next to the bathroom. It was an odd place for the freezer, and I realized that I couldn't hear any of the others in the class. So, I walked into the freezer and kept it ajar by pulling the fire extinguisher off the wall and setting it down. It was so cold. Go figure. I looked around for the bags of ice that Mario the instructor told me about. I spotted them and grabbed them and went to leave. When I closed the freezer door and put the fire extinguisher back onto the wall, I noticed a strange sound coming from one of the bedrooms. It was like a horrible grunting or groaning. Not the sound of what you would assume. It was like an animal. But there was no way this could be a domesticated pet. I've always loved animals, so I wasn't initially afraid, just curious. I continued standing there. A waft of something burning poured out into the corridor. It kind of resembled burning plastic or material. That was when I panicked, as I thought the entire place was on fire. I knew that I had no chance other to investigate, and that the owners wouldn't mind at all. I walked into what appeared to be the master bedroom, covered in blood, orange quilts, curtains, and carpet. There was an accompanying bathroom where I could hear grunts and groans, and even smoke. What the hell was going on? I threaded carefully into the bathroom, and my heart fell into my knees at the sight in front of me. It was a snake, writhing around in the bathtub, knocking over stuff, and the bathroom curtain was slightly on fire at the bottom. Only this was not a snake. This thing had two heads, one of each end of its body. It was a two-headed serpent of some kind, except again, not like you would think traditionally, but a head on each end. My mouth gaped open as I took in the horror of whatever this thing was. The creature was now gliding on the ground, up and down the bathroom poles. It was well over 8 feet. Its eyes, too, were orange and small. Little slits, which seemed to glimmer and dart around the room. I wondered what I should do. It was clearly a hazard having this animal in the house. I almost wondered if this was his pet and had escaped. Surely such a thing was a danger. I looked around and spotted an axe next to one of the fire alarms. I then contemplated about whether I should try and kill it. As if reading my thoughts, it looked over to me, dead in the eyes with both heads, and both heads opened their mouths, exposing an extremely large set of fangs and an opening where no doubt swallowed and it could devour its entire prey. It bolted towards me, and at that moment, I was able to step backwards and shut the door. I ran out of the room, back up the corridor, panting and utterly breathless. I looked backwards to see if the thing had managed to break out of the room and follow me. Thankfully, it had not. I did hear a thrashing and crashing sound, as if it was banging itself against the bathroom door, trying to get itself out. I had clearly aggravated the beast, and it did not like being disturbed. So, I managed to discreetly grab my coat and pulled my friend out before we went home, careful not to attract any attention. I had dropped the ice all over the bedroom. Mario texted me later that evening to see what happened, but I rang him back and told him all about the supposed snake. He then informed me that he didn't live at the property, but he went down to the freezer in the bedroom after and saw the ice scattered all over the ground. He then checked with the owners. They denied owning any pet, let alone a two-headed serpent. Mario then accused me of taking drugs in the freezer. My friends too thought I had lost my mind completely. Because the last year has been so crazy, I haven't really had time to fully process everything that has happened. Look, all I know is I saw something that was real, monstrous, savage, and clearly bizarre. I've booked into a counselor in hopes that they could shed some light on what happened. I have also looked into two-headed snakes online, but by our reports, the kind I saw only exist in mythology. I hope that my account can shed some light and hopefully attract some media attention, so maybe others who have had similar experiences can come forward and not being afraid of being cast off as crazy. Even though my story sounds hokey or even crazy by many, I stand by it firmly and will gladly tell anybody about what happened. Who knows? Maybe there truly are others out there who have seen the same things that I have. When I was just a kid, I constantly found myself at my grandmother's house. I was always staying there. She was such an angel, but unfortunately passed away back in 2014. Her house was surrounded by fields and stretches of land that seemed to go on for an eternity. This was rural Alabama, and we ran barefoot through the fields with not a care in the world. Looking back, it was such a special childhood, free from all the distractions, and very little access to screens or even technology. I felt as free as a bird on my grandmother's farm. But something happened as a child. Something disturbing, which I know I need to address as a grown woman. I believe that I encountered a real-life reptilian witch. I know I sound crazy, that if I give my name on this account, people will find me and think I have utterly lost my mind. But you don't understand. This memory has been stored in my mind and deep in my soul for well over 20 years now, and I feel like it's the time to discuss it. So, going back in time to the springtime of 1998, I want to say late April, or perhaps early May. I would have been around 9 years old. Grandmother's house was surrounded by large fields, as I said, and on this particular day, I was going down to the apple tree, as she wanted to bake us some apple pie. So, I was running down to the apple tree and climbed up on the branches. The apples were green, and as I took a big bite, they tasted of spring. I filled my basket and got ready to take them back to my grandmother's house. I heard a chirping behind me. It was the most bizarre thing. I turned around, but could see nothing. Then the chirping happened and started up again. I turned around. Still, nothing was there except the stretches of long green grass. When I turned back to grab my basket, there was a scaly hand touching one of the apples. It was green and scaly and snake-like. I shuddered and looked up. Before me was this god-awful demonic-looking thing. The only way I could describe it was skeletal, and it was wrapped in long black shawl. Whether it was a man or woman, I could not tell. Its eyes were open, bloodshot and yellow, fixed on me without blinking. The head was totally bald, showing scaly reptile-like skin and face, but almost like it was rotted away. There almost appeared to be little worms under its skin. The teeth were rotten and fang-like, and its skin was dark green to deathly pale. I tried to move back, but this creature, whatever it was fixed its hand on me, and seemed to almost rock back and forth as it attempted to pull me closer. I had no idea what it was going to do. Perhaps eat me, kill me, kidnap me. I had no idea. From the creature's head, 4 large purple horns shot up, and this creature continued to grab me and hold me with a viciousness and savagery. I closed my eyes and prepared myself to die. When it wanted me, I was not sure. The next thing I remember, it released its grip from me and retreated into the bushes before disappearing. My hands were bleeding, and I had a large wound. I looked up to the hill and could see my grandmother staring down at me. She ran to hold me. I began crying and started to explain to her what had happened. She told me she saw it all. We went back to her house, and she told me a very similar thing had happened when she was a little girl. It was deeply traumatic. She told me this, and she never quite got over it. Grandmother and I would talk about the incident for many years to come, right up until her passing. We both never veered that we saw something supernatural, demonic, and terrifying. At times, this creature still appears in my nightmares, and I wake up imagining its scaly hand locked over mine. I still have a car where it struck its force into my childish hands. I am writing this now, many years after the incident, and I hope that somebody else can come forward and tell me they have maybe seen something similar. At my grandmother's funeral, we also baked an apple pie in her honor. I went up to the attic and had the urge to look out at the old tree, now neglected with age. You wouldn't believe this, but I could have swore that I saw the same strange figure submerged at the bottom of the trunk. I just shuddered and walked away, not wanting to see any more, and hoping that I wasn't truly seeing the horrors of my past. I am lucky I survived. I hope that I can connect with anybody else who has seen something that they can't necessarily comprehend. I hope my description is thorough enough. Like I said, the best way for me to accurately paint it is it was half reptile, half human, but it looked dead and skeletal, with patches of flesh missing, and what appeared to be little bugs under its skin. It's like it was a living dead creature of some kind. It was terrifying. What happened to me as a child vividly lives on in my memory. I know it was real. It still reaps trauma into my everyday life, even as I write this. A couple of years ago, my fiancé, who was my boyfriend at the time, had his sister invite us to her wedding down in San Diego. We're from New York City, so at first we had the idea to just catch a flight. But then I was struck with a fun idea. I brought up how we could leave a few weeks early and take a leisurely road trip instead. So, by the time we arrived in California, we could take a few days to rest and recharge before the ceremony. I had never really been outside of the East Coast, so I was excited about the idea of being able to take in new sights. You wouldn't be able to see much from 30,000 feet up in the air. After some discussion, we decided that if we were to do such a thing, it would be most convenient to rent a car and return it upon our arrival, instead of just taking our own vehicle. From there, we would simply take a flight home, sparing us from having to take the time to drive all the way back. So, when it came time to leave, we got our rental car, packed our things, and did the standard routine check of making sure the stove, oven, and lights were off, and being sure that the house was locked and left. Most of the trip went as expected. We had our fun days of stopping in different destinations, like Indianapolis and St. Louis, visiting the multiple attractions they had to offer, and our not-so-fun moments of getting caught in heavy traffic, or having to stay in a hotel that was a bit beyond our budget. Regardless, it was pretty cool to be able to experience things I had never had the chance to before. Overall, things went pretty smooth. That is, until we hit New Mexico. It was nighttime, and we ran over something. I'm not sure what it was, but it was enough to cause one of our front tires to pop, and the car was practically bouncing from the roughness that ensued. We pulled over and went to check out the damage. The whole tire was practically shredded, hanging onto the car by a thread. We went to look for a spare tire, and my heart sank as we soon discovered that there wasn't one. The service nor data wasn't very good out where we were, leaving us next to stranded. The good news was that the GPS attached to our car used satellites instead of cell towers, so it was still operating just fine. The bad news was that it used the car as its power source, so it would be rendered useless if we took it out. My fiance then had an idea. He took out his phone and opened the Notes app and copied the directions to the nearest town. It was about 5 miles out. Upon getting there, we could hopefully find a place to stay and have enough service to call the rental company to let them know about the car and see what we could do from there. We wanted to wait a bit before doing that though, just to see if we could flag down another car to speed up the process. After about 15 minutes or so with nothing, we decided to make our journey on foot. Both of us were very nervous about leaving so many of our belongings behind in the car, but with how much we had packed, it was impossible to take it all with us. We locked the car, of course, but that didn't mean it was impossible for somebody to shatter the windows and haul our stuff out, including my dress and his suit, both of which were rather expensive. A few minutes into our journey, I could make out the silhouette of a man running some distance away. It was late, but considering I was with my fiance, I wasn't exactly scared. I figured it was just a late-night jogger, although I couldn't understand why he chose to run across the land instead of by the street. Then, he turned around, and the new angle allowed me to see something trailing behind him. I squinted my eyes, trying to make out what it was. It wasn't until then that I noticed how bizarre his face shape was. It was much more rectangular than I'd ever seen on a person. I had to ask my fiance, "What is that?" from beside me. I told him I didn't know. My best guess was a strange-looking person. The man only seemed to be getting closer, and I turned on my phone's flashlight. I gasped as the light caused the man's eyes to reflect back at us. Then, I was able to see his form in its entirety. Its frame was at a bit of an obtuse angle, with the bumps of its spine sticking out like spikes. Its arms were significantly shorter than its legs, and its hands only appeared to have 4 fingers, with long, sharp, black nails at the end of each one. Its face resembled that of a person's, but it was so bizarrely shaped for being such that it was practically uncanny. Its eyes were like that of a snake's, and I soon realized that the thing had been trailing behind its body was in fact its tail. It had no skin. In fact, it appeared to be covered head to toe in dark green scales. This creature hissed at us, revealing a long snake-like tongue that was previously hidden with its mouth. My fiance and I ran, screaming and yelling for help as we did. This thing paced itself behind us, continuing to hiss and snarl. Some distance below, I could make out the lights of a small town. However, we were too high up on the cliff we were on to safely navigate our way down. Instead, we had to keep following the road, which wind down into the city, and who knew how long that could take. I then thought of something. I stopped in my tracks, picking up a few rocks nearby. My fiance asked what I was doing. I turned around and threw one at the creature. The first one missed, but the second one hit it right in the forehead. It made a noise of pain and stopped briefly, shaking its head. My fiance and I continued running, but this monster only seemed to be even angrier. It picked up its pace, and it wasn't terribly fast, but neither were we, and I had no idea whether or not we had enough stamina to outrun whatever this was. Once we were nearly down the cliff, a car had driven past us, loudly honking its horn as we were far too close for his or her liking. The creature screeched and ran off somewhere to the side, but we continued moving forward. It didn't seem to follow us anymore, but we weren't going to take any chances. As we neared the entrance of town, we finally allowed ourselves to catch our breath. We walked into a nearby McDonald's, got ourselves water before anything else, and then sat down in one of the booths, taking a minute to try and piece together what had just happened. My fiancé tried to lighten up the moment by reminding me that we, in fact, did end up making it to our destination. We tried calling the rental company, but we just got an automated message that their offices were closed for the night and that we needed to call back in the morning. Not knowing what else to do, we walked to a small hotel and rented a room. We were exhausted, and despite what had just happened, fell asleep easily. It definitely helped that we had each other. The morning after, we called the rental company before anything else. They said that they would send out a tow truck to get the car fixed, and that we could pick up the car in town later that day. We checked out of the hotel and went back to the McDonald's and had breakfast. My fiancé says the closest thing he could find to what he saw was a chupacabra, but even then, some depictions made it appear as if it were a dog or coyote-like creature, not a reptilian-looking thing. So we were left pretty stumped as to what the hell it was. Whatever the case, I was just glad it wasn't after us anymore. We spent the day wandering around the town as we waited for that call if our car was fixed, but there really wasn't much to see. When we finally received the phone call, we picked up our car and made sure everything was still there. When it appeared to be fine, we stopped by a gas station to pee, fill up the car, and get some snacks. When we were ready to get back on the road again, both of us let out a little laugh as we realized that we would have to return to the same place we were chased down in order to get back on track for San Diego. Upon our return to the road, I swore I could see webbed footprints lightly imprinted in the more sandy areas of the terrain. But I just shook my head and let myself relax, putting my feet up on the dashboard. The rest of our trip was fine, and we managed to make the best of it despite what had happened. By the time the wedding ceremony came around, we found ourselves telling the tale over and over again to different groups of people. A lot of people didn't take it too seriously, as to be expected, and to be fair, neither did we. Pretending it was just something stupid made it easier to cope with, I guess. A lot of people brought up the chupacabra thing, just like my fiancé did, and others joked it was somebody from the town trying to scare away the tourists. You know, the whole Scooby-Doo thing. We eventually flew back to New York, and it never really came up beyond that point. After all, we had other things to attend in our lives, like our jobs and social events. Still, it wasn't long after before my fiancé proposed to me, and I do think that event, along with the inspiration from his sister's wedding, played a heavy role in his decision to do so. Maybe I'm reading a bit much into it, but to me, it symbolized that life could throw all sorts of crazy stuff at you, and that if you could handle such an intense experience with a person you love and make it through okay, then the two of you could take on anything. Things like bills would be nothing in comparison to what we went through. Anyway, I've never returned to the Southwest region since, and I don't really plan to. I'm not exactly scared of stumbling upon that reptile man again, considering it was in rural New Mexico, and I don't exactly have a reason to go back there. Still, it makes me wonder what other kinds of creatures are out in the world, waiting for unsuspecting victims to come across them, perhaps even where I reside. Whatever the case, I'm just glad I live in a place where there aren't many reptiles, or reptile men. I've been meaning to reach out to you for some time now. My name is Dylan. I have a very in-depth background in cryptozoology. I'm currently 38, work from home, and I spend a lot of my free time researching and understanding cryptids. But I also spend a lot of my time hiking in the woods, exploring, and doing my own solo trips out in the wilderness of the United States. Anyway, I listened to your content already, so you're speaking my language since you know so much about cryptids just like I do. And I want you to know, before I go any further, in case you decide to read this, that I want you and everybody else to know this is not a case of mistaken identity. I have done enough research on Bigfoot, Dogman, and most other cryptids people don't even know about to know that what I saw, there's just no mistaking. I don't know if this thing has a name per se, but it was very defined, and that I've never seen anything else that looks like this. This sighting also took place in broad daylight, where there was no shadow, nothing obstructing it from view, and I only saw it from about 30 feet away, so I got a good look at it for more than just a few seconds. And being a cryptozoology enthusiast, it doesn't take long to start getting involved in the community, getting stories, sightings, and encounters from fellow friends. Basically, I've heard through the grapevine that there is a large population of not only Bigfoot, but buffalo wolves living out in these areas. Now, when I set out to hike and do my solo adventures, my intent is to never encounter or run into a cryptid. In fact, even though I'm really enthusiastic about the whole thing, that's the last thing I want to see, because I have that innate human primal fear in me that seeing something that I was told isn't supposed to exist just terrifies me. Let me go ahead and get to that. So, as you know from what I told you, I definitely frequent the woods of the United States, doing my own solo camping trips, exploring and whatnot. I'm a bit of an outdoors junkie as it is, which is why my love of cryptozoology matches up so well with my lifestyle. I do lots of frequent camping, and prefer to be in the outdoors more than I do inside. Anyway, this June, I was spending a couple weeks at the time exploring the outback areas of Montana, hiking around and sightseeing as much as I could. But this is the area where I had a sighting that I can only chalk up to what I thought was never possible. Now, I don't like using this term, because it really sounds like something you'd pull from a Dungeons & Dragons game. But, unfortunately, it does and is the only thing that accurately describes the physique in what I saw. A werebear. Now, before I go any further, let me stress that I do not believe this was a person that is transformed into a bear. I think that's very silly and nonsensical. I do believe that this was another cryptid among the many that I was lucky enough to witness. Although terrifying, I believe that this creature or cryptid shared the same physical attributes that you would see in the fantasy setting that a werebear has. As far as the setting goes, I had come across a river. I couldn't tell you exactly what river it was, but if I looked on a map and spent time, I could probably write you back and tell you exactly what river I was at. Anyway, I was walking up against the riverbank on the west side when I heard a loud shuffling on the opposite bank. Out from behind some rocks stood up this massive bear. At least at first I thought it was a bear, and I realized this thing was standing on two legs like a bear, but the body looked entirely wrong. This thing was towering in height, and I know exactly what a bear looks like. I've seen them in the wild on numerous occasions, and again, this had a completely wrong body. I know bear do stand up on their hind legs. I'm well aware of that. But like I just said, and I cannot stress this enough, the body looked entirely differently than just a brown bear. Although what confused my mind, because it's only used to this realm of reality, was that the head was that of a brown bear. Kind of grizzly bear, I guess you'd call it. But the body was frightening, because it resembled that of a human being. And even the fur and hair on its body was very short compared to that of a brown bear. You can simply Google any bear, and you can see that the hair on their body is rather long and thick. But this, it was short and shaved down almost. Like it looked wrong. Even the hair and fur on its body was just not normal. When it stood up on two legs, it watched me, and it had an expression on its face that looked far more intense than any normal animal I've ever looked at. It's almost like I can see intelligence in his face, like it was studying me, observing me. This thing had a chest, torso, arms, and legs just like a man did, to a T. And also, the physique on this thing. It was ripped. Absolutely ripped. I'm talking rippling muscles underneath its short fur. And this thing looked like it had been lifting weights, day in and day out. It was also easily 9 feet tall, if not taller. I had to look up at it, into its eyes, to see it. That's why when I say this thing was towering above, I wasn't lying. Its face just read one simple expression: turn back. That's the best way I could sum up the look on its face. I was completely horrified at the moment, and also stunned at what I was seeing. However, because I had experience in survival classes and being out in the wilderness, I knew that you should never run from any sort of predator. So, I was able to maintain my composure and locked eyes with this creature and backed away very slowly until I was able to safely get out of the area. I've spent ample time all over the internet, Reddit for one, and other various sites, even going as far as contacting various people in the cryptozoology realm, and nothing. I have not talked to anybody who has seen or talked to any eyewitnesses that have seen a creature like this before. I don't know if you have, or if anyone else has listening to this, if you are reading this, but please, I would love for somebody to reach out to me. I want to know that I'm not the only one who has seen this. Even though I do have a love for cryptozoology, and it's not that I'm not having a hard time believing what I saw, I just can't be the only one to see this cryptid. Little did I know, that day, upon that river, I was going to encounter whatever this creature was. I mean, looking back, it really was a perfect area to seclude and never be hidden. Montana is pretty much a dead zone anyway. There's a whole lot of state and not a whole lot of people. If I was some sort of cryptid and I wanted to remain hidden, that's a good place to go. I feel like it's also important for me to state that even though I do have a love and obsession with cryptozoology and creatures in general, I have never once had a personal encounter with anything, even through all the backwoods hiking and exploring I've done. Not Bigfoot, not Dogman, nothing. So this is kind of a first for me, especially when I saw what I did, and I realized in that moment that this was neither a Bigfoot nor a Dogman, but something else entirely. Some sort of monster from the woods. And is it possible that had I stuck around, this thing would have taken me and ended my life? Well, I think it's possible, but that's why I wasn't wanting to stick around to find out. That's why I got out of there ASAP. As I mentioned to you earlier, I got a chance to get involved in the community, and even though at the time I didn't have any stories to share or swap, I got shared a bunch of encounters and sightings of not only Dogman, but Bigfoot. And these are the same individuals that once I had my sighting, I got to share my experiences with them. But to no avail. They had never heard of such a creature before, and once again, I'm left wondering with no answers and no conclusions or resolutions. Truly, part of me firmly believes that I was the first person to see such a creature, but maybe not. I just have yet to find the right person to share their encounter with me. Hopefully, if your audience hears this, one of them will have had an encounter with the same creature. And again, I don't know if these creatures are exclusive to the Montana area. I just know that's where I had my sighting. For all I know, they could be all throughout Canada, and all of those thousands of acres of wilderness, uncharted and untouched by mankind. In conclusion of this email, I guess it should be no surprise to us that there are creatures out there that we have yet to see, the same as anyone discovering a cryptid for the first time. Have a wonderful day. Hello, what lurks beneath. I'm a lifeguard at Harriet Beach in Miami, Florida. Or I was. I am writing into you to discuss and inform you of a recent incident just a few years ago on one of the beach resorts that has completely ravaged the tourism industry and led to a total lack of visitors in this very small area. Now, unless you're from there, you probably didn't really hear much of it, but this happened very quickly, and was quickly cleaned up. I had been a lifeguard there for a while, about 10 years, since I was 18. I loved my job, the ocean, the people, even the beach bum life. It was my jam. But every day, I was beginning to feel this beach and resort had become something of a horror flick. Strange things had been happening. Very strange, disturbing things. At the time, and I still think there is, was a full-scale FBI investigation into the circular events occurring. Myself and the rest of the staff there were huge subjects in this investigation and were constantly being questioned. If you are reading this, well, you need to dismiss your notion of Florida as a haven of relaxation, enjoyment, and leisure, and instead, imagine a place where you feel unsafe, disturbed, and clouded in a feeling of impending terror. This is worse than Jaws. I don't know how much it's been cleaned up and taken care of since the COVID issue, but this is how it was when I was there. It was January that the first incident happened. I was catching a few waves on my surfboard, as we do when it's quiet. This was like 6 a.m., and so there wasn't many on the beach, except for a few joggers. I had my swimming shorts on and my seafoam green surfboard. It was tied to my ankle using a long leather leash like many surfers do. The currents were a little wild, and I remember feeling a little unsettled that the waves seemed to be stirring from all different directions and seemed a little erratic. They were usually totally calm and serene at this time in the morning. I saw a huge wave coming, and I couldn't wait to ride it. This was my life. Feeling free, alive, and at one with the ocean. It was an epic wave, and as I shot up on my surfboard, my glance extended right to my Pinewood Beach hut, where I would look out at the sunset with my own binoculars. As I rode that wave, feeling the electric adrenaline sent jolts of excitement up my spine and right to my head. My eyes shot down to my feet as the hazy sight of something like blood seemed to be seeping from my own ankle. Uh-oh. I gently stopped my surfboard and sat on it, putting my feet up to get a closer look. My ankle had been badly wounded, and blood was coursing out in a steady stream, modifying the azure blue with great bursts of explosive red. Okay, maybe not that dramatic, but you get the idea. It was the strangest thing, as I had zero sensation of pain and no knowledge of having been bitten by anything. Shark attacks were common, but I knew how to read the signs, and my surfboard had a fin at the bottom to avert any shark attacks from occurring. Still though, I scanned the waters and saw nothing. At that moment, I turned around at the sight of something large and green swimming about 15 feet away from me. As the water was pure from this side, I noticed it had scales, large spikes, and what looked like teeth on its back. Was this a crocodile? I didn't think we had saltwater crocodiles down here. It was utterly bizarre. This creature turned around in a circle and protruded its face above the water, so it was not facing me. That's when my stomach sank, witnessing a large creature with a face of that of a dinosaur from times gone. Large eyes the size of small footballs, green, thick, scaly skin, and a green horn which was jagged and extending about 1 foot above its forehead. I had never seen such a creature before, and I knew instantly it was responsible for the wound on my foot. I managed to swim gently back to the shore and observe the creature as I stood there in the sand. My wound still coursing speckles of blood on the sand. So, I limped back to my hut, and after bandaging my foot, tried to use my binoculars to observe if the creature was still there, and if there was any more nearby. I immediately informed my manager, who decided to close that part of the beach for the day. He thought it was just some kind of fish, and that maybe I had just exaggerated the sighting, which is not uncommon when you're being pumped full of adrenaline and fear. But I knew what I saw. So, I took 2 weeks off on medical grounds. Even though my foot healed and I felt better, my nerves were completely wrecked. No one believed me or took me seriously. Not even my girlfriend, friends, or close family. They all believed it was too early in the morning and I was tired. But listen, I know what I saw. It was something monstrous. Some creature that I've never seen before, and I'm not sure if anybody else has. When I returned, the beach was running again as normal, and it was busier than ever. As I sat there in my hut, I looked from left to right, and it was extraordinary hearing and seeing such joy when just 2 weeks before, it had been a scene of terror. I always felt super comfortable working in the sea, having always been an avid swimmer. But as I looked out into the ocean, I felt sick and couldn't imagine anything worse than having to go back into it. Thankfully, there were no incidents in which I needed to rescue anybody. I began to see the creature everywhere. If anyone was swimming with a green t-shirt, my eyes would play tricks and I would shoot up, expecting to see some mayhem and carnage unfold before my eyes. A jolt of fear would trickle down my body, and I would break out in a cold sweat, even though it was ridiculously hot outside. I knew this wasn't a healthy way to live, and so I decided to seek help from my doctor. I started anti-anxiety medication and told the doctor about what I saw. Like everyone else, he put the vision down to stress and asked me if I used any recreational drugs at the time. I was really pissed off. As I sat home during one of my off days, I was surviving off crap food, toast and Twinkies. I couldn't even make love to my girlfriend, and I'm a 28-year-old guy with a beautiful girl. Whatever creature this was, it had unsettled me in a way that I never encountered. Just total anxiety. I even tried listening to some calm music, even some ASMR, but every time I closed my eyes, the large glassy eyes of the beast, cold and monstrous, would send a jolt of panic down my spine, and I would subconsciously flap my arms as if trying to swim away from the horror. I even had a secret desire for the creature to reappear and wound somebody else, so I would know that I had not gone crazy, at least not entirely. As I sat there in my lonely apartment, my phone rang, and it was my manager. He told me I needed to come in, and that I wouldn't want to miss this, and that he believed me. I remember sighing deeply, knowing that when I arrived, there was likely going to be another attack. But I didn't press him for any more details. I told him I would be there as quick as I could. So I took my bike, and I remember I pedaled maniacally. My legs were so numb and felt like jelly when I arrived because I pushed so hard. I didn't even bother to fasten my bike or secure it. I remember I just left it and ran to the office, where I was likely to meet my manager and be informed of whatever had happened. I remember that as I arrived at the office, our reception lady had pointed me to the very edge of the beach, close to the waves, where there was a large crowd that had gathered around what looked like a washed-up animal. It was green and long, and I instantly knew what it was. The beach was empty. It had obviously been evacuated, and there were cops circling around the area with clipboards, taking photographs. It was a surreal sight, like a crime scene right there, like I was living on the real-life set of CSI Miami. No children laughing, no ice cream, just the taste of fear in my mouth as I bit my lips, nearly causing it to bleed with trepidation. My manager had gestured to me to walk down, and I held onto my stomach, hoping I would not churn out the contents of my breakfast. My manager had informed me afterwards that the police had arrived as a beast, a reptilian-like sea creature, had its stomach severed. It was now dead, and it was found to have at least 5 to 6 human remains in its stomach. The remains were obviously detached and fragmented, but there was a forensic team on site who were confident that it was more than just one body. There was also a marine biologist present, taking more photographs and using his portable computer. I remember him squinting over the screen, and he simply didn't know what it was, and that he had never encountered such a thing. I'd asked my colleagues even, but the species was unknown from what I heard. One of the officers had informed me that this would be an ongoing investigation, and that some kind of plan needed to be conjured to stop people from using this section of beach. If word got out that a creature like this was commonly swimming in the water, there would be panic. Thankfully, no real word got out that I'm aware of, so I didn't have to worry about it going viral. And surprisingly, there really hasn't been any images of it that I can find on Google or Pinterest or anything. But of course, to me, the beast was real, and I was attacked by it. Luckily, it should be buried in the past, buried where it can't get to anybody, and nobody has to know it exists. As I write this, I can only thank the universe for protecting me. To have escaped with such a mild wound was amazingly lucky. This creature had obviously been intent on killing me and consuming me. It was a terrible end for anybody. I thought of those poor souls who had met such a tragic end. Had they enjoyed surfing like me? Were they adults, practically children, or were these recent killings of the time? It's not uncommon for surfers and swimmers to go missing or to drown and their bodies to not be recovered. I mean, usually bodies are recovered, but missing persons does happen, even on the ocean. To think that my job, which at the time I had relished and enjoyed so much, was now a scene of horror and brutality. Every day, it felt like a nightmare afterwards. That section of beach had been closed all year, and thankfully, once COVID came and hit, it made it easier. But really, it's because we fear another attack. Until the forensics have more information, which I never received, and why would I was not an important part of any investigation, really. There was also a team of academics around the world who are aware of beasts like this and creatures that exist. Anyway, we need to keep a lookout for more reptilian creatures like this in the ocean, waiting to emerge to consume anyone or anything. Who knows what let it out here to the coast of this beach? Perhaps its food chain was disrupted, or maybe it changed its sights on what it was wanting to eat. I don't quite know how to say this, so I'm just going to come out and say it. I saw something the other day in the swamp that just confused the utter dickens out of me. There are two reasons that I like to go to the swamps. One, because I like to row down it and enjoy nature as it is supposed to be. Two, is because I am part of a neighborhood watch. I'm not sure what to call it, but I basically go out and look for animals that are in danger and try to keep some animals away from poachers if I can. On one of my trips out, I noticed something lying in the way off the side of the river that looked like it may have been injured. It was laying on its side, and it was partially on the bank and partially in the water. I thought it might have been killed by something, or it was injured from something. I rowed off to the side of it and got out of my boat. I grabbed my snare pole out of the back and used the handle end to nudge the animal to see if it might have been resting. But it didn't move. Now that I was closer, it looked like it was a young crocodile, maybe only 5 months old. Well, the weird thing is, down here in America, we don't have crocodiles. We have alligators. So this looked very weird to me. I got my snare around to where I thought its head would be, and I pulled it out of the water so it could breathe. When I saw that it wasn't an alligator or a crocodile, I don't know if I can describe it quite right, but it looked like a dog. Like a crocodile dog. I know that sounds weird, but that's what it looked like. It had the ears of the dog, the eyes of a dog, and a snout that quite resembled more of a crocodilian-looking thing. Except it had the trademark teeth of a crocodile. It was hideous looking. I also noticed that it had huge claws, and it had a mixture of fur and scales. What the hell? I thought. Was this some sort of science experiment gone wrong? Its body was green, but again, it looked and kind of resembled a dog. A very thick-skinned kind of animal. It was very hideous. Its mouth was hanging open too, like if it was panting. I took the snare off it and climbed back into the boat. I grabbed a beef jerky stick out of my backpack and opened it. I stayed in the boat, but I threw it towards the thing to see if the smell of meat would wake it up. I saw its nose twitching from the smell. It moved its head sideways to eat it. Whatever it was still very weak and small and frail, but I didn't know why. I grabbed my water and got back out of the boat. I slowly poured the water near it so it could drink. Normally, I think I should be terrified by whatever this thing was, but it was injured and in a state that was almost near death. I checked its body for any kind of wound, and I saw that it had a gunshot on its side. It was then that this creature, whatever it was, began to act very aggressive towards me, and almost coming back to life the closer I got to it. It started snapping at me and getting very lively all of a sudden. Maybe it was best that I step back into my boat, I thought, and so I did. And this thing started to become much more aggressive and hostile in nature, almost beginning to gain its strength back in a sort of second. That's when it started to try and stand up on two legs. Even though this thing was tiny, frail, and clearly hurt or injured, it didn't like that I was trying to help it. Even though I didn't care that this thing looked like a failed science experiment, it was in my inner best heart that I wanted to see this thing brought back to health, no matter how hideous it was or unnatural it was. Again, I've never seen a creature like this before, but the second it started acting aggressive and trying to attack me with as little strength as it had, that's when I realized I should get out of there, and so I did. As I'm kind of pulling away, this thing seemed to regain its strength so fast, and finally pursued me by jumping back in the water, swimming towards me. Listen, I know this sounds crazy and all, and normally I would tell you you're crazy if it did. This thing only seemed to pursue me for a little while after I got on my boat, and then disappeared underneath the water for good. I still think about it because this wasn't that long ago, and it was very weird. I've talked to some of my friends about it, and other people who are in my Animal Neighborhood Watch group, and nobody seems to know exactly what I'm talking about, or they think I'm making up the story. Anyway, believe me if you will, but this is my true sighting of something I would consider strange and unknown, and possibly paranormal. The only thing I don't quite understand is why it was so frail and weak and floating under the water, half on the shore, like it was yanked out of somewhere and thrown on its side, left to die, and then shot. Maybe it was stunned. Again, I don't really know. I'm just trying to get answers for all these questions that I have. Who really knows? Is it possible that this really was a science experiment and was pulled out here in the swamps and shot, left to die because it was a failed creation? That is something that haunts me still to this day. I'm posting this under a fake name and account, so it can't be traced. I know that probably sounds paranoid, but I just want to make sure. This needs to get out there so people can begin finding out about this creature that was so wrongfully made. It appears that you're well aware of Dogman and many of the other cryptids that exist. Well, about 4 years ago, I can tell you all more about the genetic experiments that began on hybrid creatures. These kinds of things have been going on for a very long time, so it's probably no surprise to you and people who are in that circle of knowledge. Things like this were fully field tested and were deemed to be ready, but something in the development stages went wrong. A specific breed of creatures that were part canine, part crocodilian. Some people on the team call them croc-dogs, and I guess that is what they're called now. I don't know if there are many other sightings of these things, because they're relatively new development, but it is what it is. These creatures were designed to be super soldiers, to be used in upcoming and future wars. They were constructed and pulled from the DNA of Nile crocodiles and multiple species of canine, like German Shepherd, retrievers, and huskies. We thought that if we could make a chimera-like creature, along with the many others, it would have all the best abilities of both, the discipline of a canine, and would be a perfect companion and use an enemy for troops. They could have them breach and clear whole buildings of dangerous enemies. At first, the thought that it would have specific traits, scales and thick skin, and a canine's discipline and duty. During the testing stages, there were great results. In open combat simulations, they performed amazing. Their handlers were able to train them, just like they had trained any other disciplined animal. These were truly meant to be killing machines. But we did have to change some training scenarios. I don't know if you'd call them pups, but we'll refer to them as that, the younglings, of course. They would hunt down a target and subdue them. And our testing coordinator was bitten, and it didn't end well. The ferocity of these creatures was unmatched. They were extremely dangerous and hostile, one of which we actually had to pull down the power of their bite because it was too immensely powerful. Eventually, the project was discontinued when these things were getting older, and they became far too intelligent, possessing almost a human-like strategic intelligence, and began attacking their handlers. During other combat simulations, some of them were trying to help. Not all were a problem, but they became one. They had broken out and became too much to handle. Not long after things began to go south with the project, our coordinator was told by another unofficial branch of government who oversaw the entire project, was told to basically pull the plug. So many of our small branch of these creations were put down, so to speak. However, some made it out. I'm only writing this today because I found out one of them is in the wild, and I need to know that people need to be careful. I live in Georgia, just north of a testing facility that exists that many people probably don't know about, and I know a few of them are out roaming around. Again, these things aren't very old. They're just within the past few years. And I want you to know that these kind of chimera creations are existing all over the world. Some are getting out. Some are purposefully being let out. I feel incredible guilt over having a part to play in the design and creation and being a part of this project. Listen, I understand that sending this to you probably comes off as a creepypasta because there are so many that claim to have a story like I do, but are actually fictitious horror stories. Well, I'm here to tell you that this is my own horror story, and that these things are actually going on. So it's really up to you. You can believe it or not, but I'm telling you what I was a part of, and the creation that I helped make. I can't guarantee you how many of these things are actually out there. Just like Bigfoot or Dogman, there's an undisclosed number. But, just like their cryptid counterparts, they are highly intelligent, very hostile and aggressive, and masters of hiding and camouflage, especially in their swamp environment. Hello. My name isn't important, but for the sake of the story, I'll call myself Tiffany. I'm a 15-year-old from Dublin, Ireland. I know you are based halfway across the world, but thanks to the internet, I can reach out to you and tell you about an experience I recently had that spooked me beyond belief. Let me start by saying that I'm not your typical girly girl. I run, I hike, and I even play soccer occasionally with my brothers. I don't scare easily, is what I'm trying to say, so I know when I get scared. It's bad. And this was bad. Really horrendously bad. I was having a sleepover with two of my closest friends. We did what most teens do when we have a sleepover. We chatted about boys, painted each other's nails, messing around with TikTok, and even looked out my window and used our phones for bird watching. At least that's what me and my friends do. It was such a fun evening, and I spent most of it in belly fits of laughter. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such good friends in my life, and that these were the best days of our lives. My two friends then eventually got bored, so we racked our brains on things we could do. Because we were home alone, we decided to play hide and seek, for old time's sake. It had been years since we played it, and we thought it would be fun. Being 15, you're kind of in that awkward stage between partially a kid and partially an adult. It's hard for me to even type these events, as I can feel icy fear welling up within my body. Little did I know that this game would become the darkest, most frightening experience of my life. The other two girls decided to hide first, and I would count to 30 to allow them to find somewhere really secretive. I could hear them giggling away, just like we were 8 years old again, and I knew for sure somebody went up to the attic as I heard footsteps on the stairs. I hadn't been up there in years as it's super dusty, and I always end up sneezing, but I guess this meant I would have to go up now. I finally finished and left my bedroom, peering around the corridor to an empty hallway. I figured this would not be like hide and seek from our childhood days, but they would surely find somewhere truly elusive that would be hard for me to even access. I decided to check the attic first, as I was confident one of the girls had went up there. I figured it was Chloe, as the footsteps were quite loud, and Chloe is a sturdy girl, as opposed to Jojo, who is a wafer. I thread cautiously up the steps, trying to hold my breath in to avoid inhaling the musty odor. I could hear some whispers, as if both girls had gone up and hid. "Guys, I know you are up here. It's so gross," I said, trying to stop laughing. I just had an image of them hunched in the corner, amidst cobwebs and an old tattered furniture. I opened the attic door, and all of a sudden, I didn't hear a sound. It was eerily quiet, and the light switch was off. When I turned it on, it only illuminated a portion of the room, as it was so old. It was an old bulb, emitting only a few shards of yellowy, faded light. I noticed an old dresser in the corner, and I could have swore I saw something yellow behind the cracks in the cupboard. I knew that Jojo was wearing a yellow jumper, so I immediately knew it was her. I stood back though for a few seconds, and admired that she was brave enough to come up to the attic and find the cupboard in the dark room, and managed to not hurt herself. It almost seemed impossible, as I stood there imagining it. I also thought I would have heard her breathing or laughing, but the room was deathly quiet. As I reached out to open the handle, I had the oddest feeling I should turn, as if something was preventing me from opening it. I knocked away the crazy notion and flung the door open. At that moment, at least 10 bats flew out of the old dresser, out of the attic, and right into the hallway. I screamed at the top of my voice, falling to the ground and knocking my head against an old pram. That must have been mine when I was a child. I thought the other girls would have ran up to me, but I laid there for around 30 seconds, moaning as I had hurt my head and ankle. Before me, however, was a vision that made my blood run cold. My mouth must have opened to fit a football through it, and my eyes felt like they had been pried open. They were wide in horror and shock. A large spider, the size of a coffee table, stood before me. But the thing about this spider is, it had the face of a man. I tried to scream, but my mouth was dry with dust and fear. This creature was black with 10 legs, what appeared to be antler-like appendages, and huge antennae raising out of its head. It also seemed to have large black wings that had tiny red spots all over them. I couldn't believe what was happening. Had I been knocked unconscious? Was I suffering from an hallucination? I continued staring at the creature, hoping it would not kill me, but expecting it to any second. How would my family find me? Bloodily mutilated in the attic, with no sign of anything? Or would the creature eat me, and I would disappear without a trace? But still, the creature continued to stare, not indicating an overt aggression in behavior, but its posture spoke power and dominance over my now horizontal and injured body. I heard my friends running and shouting my name. Had they got worried? I could hear their footsteps climbing the attic door, and I turned to see them. At least if the creature killed me, I would see the faces of my friends as my last vision, and not the beast before me. When they arrived, I turned back, expecting the creature to pounce on all of us, but it was gone. There were no signs of it at all. I screamed in terror, telling them to run and to carry me. I knew the creature had to be somewhere, but one of the girls went back to check and found nothing. So too, my parents checked when they got back, and of course found nothing. I began to think I was crazy, that I had made it all up. Maybe I had some sort of paranormal experience. I don't know. But after reading stories on the internet, I now believe that I encountered some sort of large insectoid creature. It was hands down the most disturbing and unsettling experience of my life. The after effects have been equally horrendous, as I have had to drop out of school. My hair has fallen out due to stress, and sometimes I can barely eat. I am due to see a counselor next week who specializes in post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'm pretty sure they're going to think I have schizophrenia, especially once I tell them my encounter. You know, the whole ordeal just makes me want to scream. That's why I'm getting in touch, to see if you can help me and connect the dots with other people who have had any sort of similar experiences, whether it be in the woods or their own houses. Perhaps you can help me get through this. I strongly believe that the whole experience I had, whatever this thing was entirely paranormal. Hi. I had an experience when I was only 17 years old that I have never spoken about till now. I filed a police report about it at the time, but it was never dealt with, as the town I am from was so small. The cops didn't really do a thing. I believe I had some sort of sighting of something that I can't be too sure or explain. It was Halloween of 1995, and me and some of my friends went to shoot a documentary in our local woods. Listen, I know it sounds very Blair Witch, but it was actually a documentary about the role of trees for dispersing oxygen in the environment. I am an environmental scientist, and so I've always loved nature. But I guess what I saw on that trip showed me a different side of nature, a monstrous side to it, that perhaps it can spawn things so deadly and abhorrent to us humans that it makes us want to die. Because that's how I felt when I had this sighting, and anytime I think of it, I also feel a sense of dread and fear. I woke up at 3 a.m. one night. I was sharing a tent with one other girl. I got up to pee a little away from our camp, and I could see still the burnt embers where we had our toasted marshmallows just a few hours prior. I remember being a little appalled at how much litter we had created, but that was my conservationist instincts kicking in, even back then. After I had finished urinating, I stumbled back into camp. As I stood there, just on the margins of the camp, I could feel somebody's eyes on my back. It was the strangest thing. It was as if I could actually feel 2 laser beams burning my back. I turned around, feeling a little spooked, and squinted to see what looked like a large spider creature in the distance. I squinted again, and the figure seemed to take the shape of a man with large black wings. There was a purring sound from the creature, and its wings flapped open, wider and wider, revealing a myriad of dark colors amidst the black. I remember feeling awestruck and terrified. I was clearly encountering something supernatural. But then, my science instinct kicked in, and I thought maybe this was some kid from our school who we had heard were going camping and wanted to goof around with us. The creature, or whatever this was, alien being, demon, call it whatever you will, it continued to watch me, and I attempted to outstretch my hand to see what would happen. I know that sounds crazy, but I was immensely curious to get a closer look. At this gesture, the creature flew away, in a vertical line into the sky, leaving a trail of cobwebs and a purple-like aura after it. It was almost otherworldly. It was the weirdest thing, and I began to think I was having an hallucination, but I knew I wasn't. It was all too real. I could feel it in every pore of my body. When my friends woke me up the next morning, I told them about it, but they thought I was just messing around. I guess 25 years later, I wonder if I encountered some unknown species, half man, half insect. Perhaps some nocturnal, antisocial creature that was disturbed by me and my campers. Whatever it was, I haven't come across anything similar in all my nature excursions over the years. I hope you can help me find out what this creature could have possibly been. I've heard stories of the Mothman, but I don't exactly know if what I saw would count as that. Anyway, based on what I encountered, I felt the urge to write in. 2020 is the year, after all, of self-healing and discovery, and I know I have buried this memory for far too long over the last 25 years. I used to be a trucker way back in the day, and I've had all sorts of weird encounters and experiences, especially at truck stops. Those are not places you want to be late at night. But anyway, what I'm here to tell you about is something that I simply cannot explain, and there's no writing it off as something I dreamt or made up or had a vision of. This was a real flesh and blood creature. Let me explain. I was currently en route, and actually around the Point Pleasant area in Virginia, when I felt a heavy thud on the back of my cargo trailer. I decided to pull over, since it felt like there was some added weight. After pulling over, I got out of my truck, and as soon as I got out and looked up at the top of the trailer, I was horrified by what I saw. Standing there, on top of my cargo trailer, was what I would describe to you, or what I know now as the Mothman. The first thing I saw were these two giant red glowing orbs. I nearly fell back onto my butt when I saw this. Then, I saw the shape surrounding it, and just how large it was. In fact, I probably saw the wings first, before I did the rest of the body. It was getting dusk out, so it was pretty dark, and there wasn't a whole lot of light. So that's why I saw the eyes first, more than the body. But as soon as I saw this thing, it didn't take me more than 5 seconds before I saw all I wanted to, and I ran back in my truck, and I floored it out of there. I guess this thing must have took off, because as I'm pulling out into the road, not only did I do it recklessly and dangerously, not even flipping on my blinker, this thing must have flew off. But when I got out to look at it, it looked right at me. Now, at the time, I had no idea there was such a thing called the Mothman, and if you had told me about it then, I would have laughed at you, telling you that you're making up fake horror stories. Well, I was quickly proved wrong. After telling some of my friends about it, they told me that that area, Point Pleasant, is actually a hotbed for Mothman sightings. And you guessed it, I just happened to be a lucky individual to have my own very sighting of this supposed thing. The thing is, I don't consider myself lucky one bit. It was terrifying. It was almost a traumatic experience. Maybe not going that far, but I have no desire to run into this thing again, nor do I want to see it. After spending some time online and reading some encounters and sightings, there's actually a plethora of sightings of this same creature floating all around the internet. And well, I haven't taken the time to write mine down and submit it to all these websites. I thought I could start by sending in mine to yours, and hopefully, if I'm lucky, you'll read it, because maybe somebody else who has had their own encounter with something entirely different, or maybe the same creature, will hear this and understand that they are not crazy or alone. You gotta understand that when you see something like this, that it is so far out of the realm of normal that you begin to suspect you're losing it, that you're going crazy, and that you're not right in the head. I thought that for quite some time afterwards, until I was finally brave enough, or maybe the feeling bothered me enough that I had to tell somebody about what happened. Anyway, I'm not going to drag this on forever. You don't need to tell me twice the Mothman is out there, and I'm going to do everything I can to avoid ever going back there. Luckily, I don't have that same job anymore, so I have no reason to go back there. Count me lucky, I guess. Back in 1972, my grandfather recounts to me that at the time, he was working as a car salesman and even was working on starting his own car business. That was until my grandfather's business fell into total financial ruin and my grandmother passed away shortly after. But something happened that he can't quite explain, that he believes was a demon, an omen that visited to him and possibly projected evil onto his life. At the time, my grandmother and grandfather lived far on the outskirts in Chicago. They actually lived in a much more rural area. I believe it was north, but it might be east. I could be wrong. Either way, one night my grandfather was driving home, and he said that he was stopped in the middle of the road by this demon with 2 wings and large glowing red eyes. Keep in mind that at the time, he had never heard of the Mothman or heard of such a thing. Since it was only 1972, media outlets didn't really have a great way of going global yet or across the US. If you didn't have the newspaper, well, you didn't really know anything unless it was word of mouth. My grandfather swears this is true, that this evil being flew down to the middle of the road and spoke telepathically to my grandfather. My grandfather actually never fully told me what this thing told him telepathically, but from what happened afterwards, he said it touched his life in the worst way. 3 months after this encounter, his wife, my grandmother, came down with stage 4 cancer and passed away just a few months later. During that time, his business also seemed to go sour, having to file complete bankruptcy and leading to financial ruin. My grandfather turned to alcoholism for 12 years before finally joining AA and turning his life around. Today, my grandfather is alive, healthy, old as can be, and he eventually remarried. But he still can't refute that is one of the scariest things that has ever happened to him, and he believes that it is a supernatural omen that came to destroy his life, or so he believes. Personally, I'm not really sure what to think about it, although it is rather convincing, because my grandfather is not a storyteller. It's just weird how this thing appeared out of nowhere and projected its own negativity onto his life. And to this day, my grandfather firmly believes that whatever this thing was, which he now knows as a Mothman, or was the Mothman, is the one that caused his wife to die and his business to nosedive into financial ruin. The only thing I can really make out of my grandfather's story is that I do know that some people believe the Mothman is actually a bad omen and only appears when a catastrophe is about to happen. It would make sense, since its first appearance was right before the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967, only about 6 or 7 years prior to my grandfather's encounter. And then, shortly after appearing to my grandfather, his wife dying and his business going sour. How else would you describe that? What could it have possibly been? Is it possible that the Mothman is actually a demon? I used to live in Point Pleasant about 9 years ago, for about 1.5 years, because I worked a job down there, in which case I ended up moving because I got married. I'll spare you an incredibly long and boring backstory and just cut right to the chase. During my time there, even though I was only there 1.5 years, I quickly made a lot of friends and grew to be a small part of the community, knowing and getting to talk a lot of people. You wouldn't believe the number of sightings that I had heard firsthand. It was enough to make a believer out of me, some of whom were very credible witnesses, like previous sheriff deputies or first responders, and they each had their own harrowing stories. Sadly, I come to you with no encounters of my own, but I can tell you from all the eyewitness stories that I had heard, it's pretty terrifying what's going on down there. Apparently, this cryptid, I guess you call it, is running rampant. Sometimes people seeing it chasing them and attacking their car. Other times, people will see it flying around in the sky. Another man who had seen it jumping from tree to tree on his way on a lone road. When I first moved down there, I had actually never heard of the local legend myself, until I quickly befriended many people in the community, and that's when it became more and more out. I was even warned about certain places around town you shouldn't go after dark. Yeah, it got that crazy, but I didn't really pay any attention. I was kind of a loner anyway, as far as going around town. I kept to myself for the most part. I didn't really explore a whole lot. I kind of just stayed home, went to a couple friends' houses here and there, was a small part of the community for some time, but I didn't really go all over the town, if that makes sense. Like I said though, the most credible and real witnesses to me were the previous employees of the sheriff's department and first responders. Their accounts were harrowing and terrifying to listen to, many of them having their very own first-hand accounts themselves, and even the deputies, or previous deputies. Man, their stories were more than enough to send chills down my spine. If you haven't really heard of the Mothman, or haven't gotten a chance to explore the Mothman, I encourage you to start Googling and looking up sightings and encounters. I promise it won't disappoint you. After being down there and being enriched in that culture and hearing all the sightings and encounters, it just proved to me right then and there that maybe monsters really do exist. I used to be a huge lover of spelunking and caving altogether, but since this experience, neither me or my friend really have much of a taste left to go back. There are cavern systems all over the world, most notably in the Northwest, the Southeast, and even the Southwest. Specifically, New Mexico and Arizona have an amazing vast cavern system underneath that interconnects and intertwines for who knows how many miles. It's pretty crazy, and while that's all good and fun, part of the fun of caving is exploring new caves and new entrances that lead to different caving systems. That's the whole fun of it. So, you guessed it, me and my friend set out on an adventure to find new caverns to explore. We did this by exploring the vast New Mexico and Arizona desert, trying to find any entrances we could, or anywhere that we might suspect might lead to a new cavern system. Well, we found quite a few, but many of them weren't very deep, or if they interconnected, parts had been caved in on, which meant they were dead ends, so it didn't take us very far. That is until we found one, which we spent all day looking and didn't find anything until we stumbled upon this system. I do believe that at some point, all tunnels and cave systems interconnect, but on this trip, we really didn't get the chance to test that theory out. We came across this entrance far in the wasteland of the desert. We were very confident that this entrance surely led to another caving system that intertwined with any close-by system around. Through many twists and turns, we kept going and going, until we got to a portion of the cave where we could start to hear a low rumbling noise. By the way, before I continue, if you end up reading this, anybody who gets to explore the caverns of the southwestern desert area, it's absolutely gorgeous. In fact, there are many tours you can take that lead you through tourist attractions all through these caves. Absolutely beautiful, and if you're into spelunking, I highly recommend you check it out. If you're a solo adventurer, it's also worth checking out. But again, after this, I think my friend and I have had our fill for a while, even in the COVID craziness. So, we're about 40 to 45 minutes deep in this cavern system, and at the time, we were in a very small chamber when we began to hear low rumbling noises, or at least that's what it sounded like. In that moment, I thought we might be underneath the road. It only made sense. But then as I listened more, and as the noise continued, the noise was coming from a chamber up ahead, and not directly above us. Something large in shape began moving towards us in our direction. That rumbling noise we were hearing now turned into a growling, guttural sound. We started booking it back towards the entrance, which was a long way, since, like I said, we were in there for probably about a good 40 minutes. Even though we couldn't exactly see what this was, something big was moving in our direction. You could hear it, and whatever it was, or whoever it was walking on 2 feet. Because of all the rocks, debris, and stalagmites, we couldn't really see what it was, but we could hear it was very heavy and moving very quickly in our direction. It must have heard us talking, or it must have heard us come through. Even though we had good lighting and good equipment, we couldn't really see it yet, until it came partially into view. Whatever this was appeared to be pitch black, and had these glowing white orbs for eyes. At least that's what we saw. It scared the living hell out of both of us. We thought that it was right there, that this is going to drag us down to the pits of hell, and we'd be gone forever. And I got goosebumps. In fact, I got them right now, just as I'm recalling this story to you, living in the moment of fear and panic. I can't even begin to describe to you the adrenaline rush that was pumping through both of our bodies. It was enough to move us quickly through and get back to the cave entrance. At some point, whatever it was chasing us had stopped. And if you know anything about caving, it isn't just as easy as running back to the entrance. There's a lot of sections and tunnels where we had to get on our hands and knees, or squeezing through tight spaces. Of course, it all depends on the cavern system you go into. Either way, whatever it was stopped following us at one point or another, and we couldn't hear it coming anymore. We eventually made it back to the entrance of the cave, and in that case, we quickly got out of there and fled. Me and this friend of mine have gone caving so many times before and have never encountered any living animals, other than maybe albino crickets or things like that. Spiders, bugs, and insects are common in caves, and it shouldn't be as a surprise. But animals, especially ones of significant size, are a rarity. It's not like we stumbled into the den of a bear. And besides, bears, to my knowledge, don't live in the desert. At least not the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. So what exactly is it that we stumbled into? What could be living that walks on 2 legs, that is totally pitch black, and gives off a terrible vibe, that lives in the New Mexico cave system? I'll try my best to really recount and give you the best description of what it is that I think we saw. Because we only got a partial view, it's hard to say. Like I told you, it was pitch black, so that I never really saw any hair or any definitive shapes. It was just large, upright, and walking. One thing I do remember, though, very distinctly, was it was breathing very heavily, kind of like a noise. It's hard to describe, really. Just try and think of a person who has smoked a pack of cigarettes every day of their life and was wheezing very heavily. Now take that and pitch drop it quite a bit. It was very deep, guttural, and not only was it growling, but it was accompanied by that horrible wheezing. Again, I don't think we really ran into a cave monster, because that just sounds too fictional for me, even though I'm the one that experienced it. But whatever it was, I just don't get the sense it was human. And then those white eyes, I have no idea what to even think about that. I kind of feel much safer now that me and him don't go caving anymore. Even though it was a huge passion of mine, I just can't get over the fear that we would run into something like this again. I mean, if that thing was living down in that cave, who knows what else we would run into? Maybe something worse. And I'm telling you now, I'm not willing to find that out. This isn't my story, but actually my good friend's, and it is quite remarkable. Well, he does a lot of solo camping, and in this case, which was about 15 years ago, got lost while exploring around in the Ozarks. Well, he came across a cavern, or what he describes was a cavern, to seek shelter in, and to hide from the elements, when he realized soon that he wasn't alone in the cavern. What he described to me, and I'll try my best to accurately relay this to you, is that he was chased out of this cavern by these large, hairy beasts that were upright walking, covered in hair, and walked just like men. There was about 3 of them, and they charged him out of the cavern from one of the lower levels of the cavern he was in. It about scared him to death, and he tells me that when he went in there, he didn't hear anything right away, but then that's when he could hear the ground around him shaking, and it getting more and more intense. And that's when he realized something, or these things, were running towards him through the large cavern opening. That's when he told me that he turned his head right and saw these things approaching him, running at him at a very fast pace, causing him to run for his life and to jump up a tree to try and keep himself alive. Whatever these hairy things were, what he describes to me now and what he believes is that they were Bigfoot and that they were inhabiting this cave. I want you to keep in mind, at this time he was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from anything, out in the Ozarks. There wasn't a soul around, and he had no idea where the nearest trail even was. And because it was about 2005 or 2006, cell phones were still much more in their infancy, and so there wasn't really any service around that he could contact anybody for help. He ended up getting rescued about 4 days later, surviving off just what little rations he had left. That story, the portion I told you, is just a very small portion of his entire survival story out in the Ozarks. But that has nothing to do with what I told you about. I just thought I would tell you about the snippet because that's what was really interesting. Maybe I can reach out to him and have him contact you, and that way he can tell you it from his perspective in full detail, exactly what he saw and what happened when he ran into that cave, because he tells it far more exciting than I can, and he's going to recall a lot more details. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Have a wonderful day, and stay safe. Hello. I'm sure you get sent a lot of stories detailing all sorts of horrible things happening to people. But one common theme that I've heard amongst some of your stories, not all of them, but just a handful, is this whole concept of Indian burial grounds. I've seen some comments on your channel that people dismiss the whole idea as being this stupid creepypasta cliche. But I'm here to tell you right now that they are adamantly very real. I cannot express this enough. Let me explain. Where I live on a bunch of land. And in fact, because of the land I live on, there's an old, well, what used to be Indian burial ground far out. And because I live on kind of like a slope that almost leads into a small valley, I have a perfect view of seeing where this monument used to be. Now, I know it's kind of hard to understand, but there's really not that much there now. The only thing that really remains is these large stone pillars that are very crude in design, and probably about 18 feet if I'm guessing. I'm not joking, and what I see upon them is exactly what I'm writing to you about. Sometimes, in the evening time, I'll see these large gargoyle-like figures perched on top. They are perfectly still like statues, but the issue being is that they are not always there. Sometimes they are there, and sometimes they are not. I've gone over to that area, hiking and exploring, and it's very uncomfortable to say the least. The entire place, not just the old burial ground, but even the land around it, has a very weird energy to it. It's a feeling. It's a very powerful feeling. It's kind of like you're walking into a field with a bunch of magnets. There's a lot of static and electricity. It's very hard for me to describe accurately. It's a place you would just have to go by yourself so you can get an idea of what it was. It's a place you would just have to go to by yourself just so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. When I bought this land many years back, I was told that these old stone pillars are the remnants of what used to be a burial ground, and that it probably was a good idea if I stayed away from it. At the time, I just assumed it was a bunch of hogwash. But then again, I can't refute the feelings that I get when I walk around it. When I'm on my back porch, I have a perfect view because, as I said, the land slopes down into almost a tiny valley, and it sits right down there. If I had to say, I'd say it's probably between 300 to 500 yards away from my back porch. There are trees in between, but it's enough that I can see the stone pillars and the tops of them. Again, I want to get back to the real reason that I'm writing to you, but I have to set up the backstory to know that this place is eerie, and I have yet to walk around this place at nighttime. The one time that I nearly did, it was evening time, and it was years ago when I was exploring the area. I kept having this awful feeling, like I was being watched, like somebody was directly behind me, like they were going to reach out for me and grab me, but nothing ever happened. I like to say that I have eyes like an owl, where I feel like I can turn my head a total 180 degrees and keep a good eye around me at all times. But even then, with that extra sixth sense that I like to say I have, I still felt like I was in danger. So now, I try and stay far away from that area. The weird thing here is that I'm seeing these large gargoyle figures perched on top of these stone pillars. There are 4 stone pillars in total, and it's usually I only ever see these 4 gargoyle figures perched on each one, or I don't at all. It's never that I only see 1 or 2, or even 3. It's either all 4 or not, and they come and go. I'm not trying to give you or feed you a fiction story. When I go out there on my porch sometimes, and they're there, it's like I'm looking at statues. They're perfectly still, and I don't think they're living beings, but I don't know why they disappear and reappear. But here's where it gets creepier. Sometimes at night, I'll hear this screaming, this loud screeching screaming. It's almost like if you were to listen to a real-life dragon, or an eagle amplified by 10, and then put through some sort of distorted filter. And sometimes at night, I'll see dark shapes moving around. It's really creepy out here. Trust me when I say that I'd be the first person to laugh at you and tell you witchcraft, LOL, big deal. But I don't know. Now that I've been living in it, my mind is kind of changed. I know natives in general probably did some crazy freaky stuff to their burial grounds. I don't know for the sake of protection or what. Or maybe it's just that their magic died with them, and beings of different realms have come to protect it. I don't know. This is all just loose speculation. But whatever it is, I cannot deny the things and the horrors that are living around that burial ground. I understand it sounds cheesy, but again, I'm here to adamantly tell you that these things are very real. In fact, I invite anybody to go exploring in any burial ground and for them to tell me that they're not sensing anything weird or seeing dark shapes or things that shouldn't be there out of the corner of their eyes. I almost sometimes feel like I'm in danger, but luckily, from where I live, and even where my back porch is, even though I have a perfect view of the entire establishment, I guess you could call it, I still sometimes feel like I might be vulnerable. Although I don't really feel anything come up to my house, so it's nothing like that. So I'm either having a very schizophrenic, lucid hallucination of these figures that look just like gargoyles, or potentially, there might be something much more evil at work here. This isn't my story, but actually one of my older cousins. He has a really crazy wild survival story of when he was serving and training in the military back in 1982. At the time, he and a few other individuals had been hand-selected for a survival training where they were to be put out in different areas of the Ozark Mountains and had to survive for 7 days with just minimal, basic supplies. Well, that's not the scary part. What is that he describes to me that he was attacked by what he says a large, half-man, half-bat creature that nearly picked him up off the ground and almost flew away with him. But he was able to break free, and what he said cut this thing's foot off with a large Bowie knife that he had. He obviously survived, and only fell about 20 feet, is what he said. He never told anybody of this encounter, at least anybody in the military, because nobody would believe him. And then years later, as he began living life, he started to hear things more like Bigfoot encounters and stuff like that happening out in the Ozarks, and how it just seems to be a general hotspot for paranormal and weird things to happen. You see, at the time, he knew nothing of Bigfoot, or anything out of that realm of normal reality, so this was quite spooky to hear. And besides, my cousin is very straight to the point and doesn't have time for BS. It is completely out of character for him to make up a story like this. And when he tells me this story, he's as serious as a heart attack. You can see the expression in his eyes as he's describing what exactly this thing looked like. He just tells me that it was a half man, half bat. There's no other way to describe it. And he said this thing was larger than him. He said it came out from the trees, or so he thought. And because he was in an undisclosed location in the mountains, and he was by himself, there were no other witnesses around to disprove or prove what he had to say. He said, though, during those 7 days, besides that whole account, he hardly if ever saw any other animals, and actually at the time went pretty hungry because he had a hard time foraging for food and even finding much meat to eat on. So that was really his excitement for the entire trip. Since him telling me this, I've tried to do some of my own research, but I couldn't really find much, other than your traditional alien stuff and Bigfoot stuff along the entire Ozark area. Now, I don't know if I really necessarily disbelieve him, because, like I told you, he's a very serious individual and doesn't have time to make up stories, and he doesn't really have anything to gain from it either. He's not looking for notoriety or fame of any kind. In fact, he even asked that I keep his identity anonymous, just so nothing can be traced back to him, and fear that he gets ridiculed, or worse, especially in today's cancel culture. He has a reputation and a lot riding on it, so he couldn't bear to have his story known publicly, unless it was shrouded in anonymity. That's the only condition he gave me to be able to share this story with you. Had this happened to another individual who wasn't near as tough or hardcore as my cousin, they might not have lived or survived to tell the tale. Anyway, that's my cousin's story. I hope you enjoy it. Do with it what you will. Hello, what lurks beneath. I came across your channel recently as I was surfing around looking for an explanation for an experience I had rather recently, which I believe to have been a skinwalker. I am not at all somebody who is immersed in ghost stories or even taking any interest in supernatural encounters, but this was an experience that has left a mark on me and has confirmed my previously speculative belief in other beings. I'm a waitress from Chicago, and one evening I was finishing my shift. It was long, very, very long, and I was tired. I do confess that I enjoy a cigarette after my shift, and I usually have this with another waiter, Mario, out of the back alleyway where we keep our food bins. Myself and Mario were standing there, chatting and talking about our plans for the weekend, when we heard a groan from behind one of the dumpsters. We both kind of jumped, but then we knew that the alleyway behind the restaurant where we go is often visited by local kids, and we just assumed they were goofing off. I was facing Mario, and he was facing the dumpsters, and we continued conversing and laughing about anything and everything. We both got along so well, and lately there had seemed to be a bit of a spark between us. We heard the grunt again, and this time, Mario yells over, "Hey, knock it off." And we expected to hear laughing and kids running away, but we didn't. Just silence. Mario shrugged it, and I felt a little weird and worried, but at the same time, I really wanted to kiss him, and I didn't want some dumb kids ruining the moment. Of course, it wasn't very romantic in an alleyway, but I had such a long day, and the manager had been totally mean to me. I needed some TLC, and this darn grunting was a pain in my neck. We heard it for the third time, and this time I snapped. "Guys, stop goofing around, or we're calling the cops." I walked over to the dumpster where I could see the alleyway behind, and to my surprise, there was no one there. It was perfectly still and secluded. The only sign of any life was a shrub, which was swaying slightly in the light night breeze. I began to think maybe it was a cat, but I had never heard of such a sound from a cat before. The whole thing was a bit spooky. We both checked our phones to ensure we hadn't seen some strange ringtone, which was playing tricks on us. Our phones were both off, so it had to have been something behind the dumpster. We both finished our cigarettes and resumed our position of me with my back to the dumpster. I began giving Mario the eye, batting my eyelashes, trying to act cute. Maybe, if I was lucky, he would kiss me. I continued watching him and realized his face had gone white as a sheet. Mario's mouth was open, in an expression of absolute horror, terror, and bewilderment. His eyes scrunched up, as if he was seeing something terrible. I turned around and immediately grabbed a hold of his arm, as I witnessed the being he had spotted. Before us, behind the dumpsters, was a man, or it looked like a man, that had to have been around 8 to 9 feet tall. This thing towered over me and Mario. But this was not any man. It was a beast. His, or her, or its body was covered in brown fur, with what looked to be white patches. His feet were stuck together, forming a solid block of marble, and its eyes were like red slits. It also had a kind of antler-like thing coming out of its forehead. I did not know what I was saying, but I immediately made an active confession as I prepared to die. I felt this beast was so monstrous that it would surely annihilate me and Mario on the spot. Whatever it was came from the pits of hell. The creature continued to stare at us with eyes filled with menace and curiosity, as if taking in these strange creatures before it. Us. We both just stood there, holding each other and shaking. I could feel this man's whimpers and moans, as if he had become a 5-year-old kid again, scared of the boogeyman. But this was a boogeyman. This was literally a beast from the pits of hell. This creature raised its hand and gestured them towards us. Its arms were now reaching up before us, and white sparks seemed to emanate from its fingertips and bolted to the sky, and seemed to almost circle over us. Mario began screaming in terror, and I fell to the ground, surrendering myself to the monster, as this was becoming unbearable. Mario's screaming stopped, and I opened my eyes, and the creature was nowhere to be found. We both continued sobbing and hugging each other for another 20 minutes before we garnished the strength to walk back into our shift. I have felt extremely emotionally unwell and fragile since this whole experience, and have not been able to eat much or sleep. I keep having frequent nightmares and have had flashbacks, which have literally made me break out in pools of cold sweat. I feel as if something is watching me, and I don't know what or how to shake this feeling off. I don't know if that creature did something to me or what happened, but I have felt violated on an emotional level since then. Mario has been off work too. He put it down as stress and anxiety, and I have no doubt that he too is experiencing total terror. I have only spoken to him once, but he kept his distance from me, as if I have somehow been responsible for the terrible sights we saw. It's, well, been only a few weeks since this event, and I need answers and a sense of healing with conclusions. I can't live like this. and I'm thinking about seeking professional help. Can you look into this and see if this was a skinwalker, or if there have been any other similar sightings in my area? Hi, my name is Larry, or for the sake of this story, I'll call myself Larry. I'm a 35-year-old accountant based in London, England. I'm writing in as I have recently been undergoing some mental health counseling, and I have an exercise in which I have to try and heal particularly traumatic incidents. When I was 17, I believe I encountered a skinwalker. I know it sounds insane, but please, bear with me. Listen to my story. I consider myself a kind and considerate person now, but when I was a teenager, I won't lie, I was kind of an a-hole. I bullied weaker kids with issues, kids from bad homes. Basically, anyone who I felt was below me, I made them feel even worse. I guess I just felt bad about myself and felt the need to embellish myself by putting others down. I feel bad about it now, and I've done a lot of work on healing the past. But one incident still haunts me to this day. So, in math class, the teacher had fallen asleep at his desk, and I decided to have some fun. I put on the teacher's glasses and began writing stuff on the blackboard. All the things I wrote were insults about the kids in the class. A few examples would be Larry Lisp Rafferty, or Michael No Mates because your mom's fat. It was pretty mean, but my friends in the class laughed and made me feel like I was a hero. The thing about it was, I never picked on anybody who I knew would stand up for themselves. I was always careful to target somebody who had low confidence and couldn't defend themselves. I guess anyone who reads this story won't have much sympathy for me, but all I can do is articulate that I am remorseful for how I treated people during my school years. Hurting people hurt people. And I guess I channeled my own self-hatred through my persecution of weaker individuals. On this occasion, in the same class, there was a class sitting at the back with long black hair. She was a pretty goth-looking girl, nose ring and all, dark eye makeup, and pale foundation to make her already look like ghostly white. She wore her hair down to her waist, and she had large glasses. She wore a dark blouse and deep purple jackets with black and purple striped stockings. She was actually quite pretty, but clearly wanted to hide her appearance away behind all the goth makeup. For the sake of the story, we'll call her Louise, but everybody called her Loser. There was a rumor going around the school that her father had been sent to prison for abusing her, and that's why she was so messed up. Her calmness and lack of interest in my bravado infuriated me. She was just sitting back there, looking out the window with her icy blue eyes. It sickened me. I wanted to make her recognize me and my power. So I shouted to her, "Why don't you come up and teach us math? You seem to teach your dad a few tricks." She continued staring out the window, and some of my friends laughed but looked pretty sheepish. I had clearly taken it too far. A single tear came down her cheek, and it was such a fragile event. I felt like someone had kicked me in the stomach. I went back to the front and picked on another kid. As I was walking home that evening, I wasn't too far from my house. I saw a dumpster in an alleyway, which was shaking. I wondered what the hell it was, but decided to just walk past it. A further bit along my path, I noticed a work van parked on the footpath. Its windows were all misty, and there was a screaming coming from within the van. It definitely wasn't lovemaking, but sounded like raccoons or some type of animal. At this point, I got a bit weirded out. For some reason, I had the urge to turn around, and when I did, I could see a figure about 10 feet behind me. It was Louise, but was not the Louise from class. This figure This creature had the facial features of Louise, but was over 7 feet tall, with eyes which seemed to emanate red, and they were striking my heart through an intense stare. Although no pain, it was total fear that I felt. Her hands seemed to be covered in a matted black fur, and thighs that had expanded to look like thick tree trunks of hunk and muscle, like a damn dinosaur. The expression from this being was of an absolute fury, and I truly believed that I was going to die. I screamed at this thing to leave me alone. As I shouted, I fell to the ground and attempted to crawl backwards. This creature's arm extended out, and it raised its hands high up. At that moment, a large amount of static electricity and lightning began shocking through the sky. I began to cry and managed to get up and run back home. When I got home, I locked myself in my room and prayed for forgiveness. I knew I had somehow angered God or the universe by my humiliation. The next day, the person who was Louise, or whatever, was gone. Rumor had it that she had left school and moved back with her birth mother to Scotland. I didn't tell a soul about my experience. Years later and now, I wonder if Louise may have been a skinwalker, I guess you would call it. It would certainly make sense from my knowledge. If you can assist me in any way, that would be great. I know very little of skinwalkers. I know they're supposed to be of American native lore and legend, but I've also heard they are also shapeshifters, which, again, I don't know anything about. But anyway, this story is real, and I'm still dealing with the trauma of it. Please, help me.